I guess I should. There we go.
Okay, here you go.
Hi folks, this is Jim Stabanis from Massey Consulting, and today I'm going to be talking about a feature of Intacct referred to as dimension relationships. And this is a great way to improve your data input, and it can also save the Intacct user a great bit of time. So let's get started and let's get moving on with this. What I'm going to do during this session is I'm going to talk about what dimension relationships are about, some requirements that you have to meet in order to set this up, how you make one. We're going to actually make a dimension relationship, and then when we're done, we're going to delete one and have you see the kind of warnings that you get and understand what you might lose by turning these off. After we make that dimension relationship, we're going to set some values, and we're going to talk about configuring the user experience, for instance, to have it autofill with a value for us automatically. Then we'll talk about the possibility of what they refer to as overlapping dimension relationships. And when we bring that up on the screen, that'll make a little bit more sense to you. And then lastly, we'll talk about what the limitations are of using Intacct's dimension relationships. All right, so some of the useful things about Intacct's dimension relationships is the idea that you can create a default value. For instance, if we have customers and they are always assigned to a specific location during data entry, we can set that default value to fill in for the customer every time we do data entry, which can save a lot of time. We could filter it so possibly they are only applicable to 2 or 3 different locations or specific revenue accounts. And then we can have cascading dimensions, which means that possibly we choose a customer that has a default location value. And then within that location value, maybe we are limited to the number of classes that we could assign to that transaction. So that's referred to as a cascaded dimension selection. One of the great values of this is that you can autofill it with a single value. I just talked about filters. And we're going to go through the data entry screens and present how this works in your actual data entry day-to-day work. I'm also going to talk about the types of relationships: one-to-one, many-to-one, one-to-many, and many-to-many. And I have a nice slide that describes exactly how that works that you might want to take advantage of. Okay, so in order to use dimension relationships, the first thing that you're going to need to do is subscribe to platform services. Now, this is a feature that you can get from Intacct free of charge. It has to be activated by your dealer. So if you don't have this, you'll have to contact your Intacct dealer and ask them to subscribe to platform services for you, and you'll see that come up. To show you where you're going to see that, I'm going to slide our Intacct screen over. And if I go into company, over to subscriptions, I'm going to see these applications that have been enabled, and I have my platform services right here. It's like a T-square and some kind of a round circle. That's the first step in using dimension relationships, is that has to be enabled. The next thing that you'll want to do is you'll want to make sure that you have the correct permissions. And for a person who is going to create dimensions, that user is going to have what they refer to as administrative permission. So I'm going to open up a user we have right here. And down here, about 2/3 way down through the screen, administrative privileges, you see this one is turned off. You're going to have at least limited admin privileges. Now, a little caveat that I'll mention is that further on in this presentation, we talk about activating some features in the general ledger setup screen. In fact, to access that screen, you will need to have full admin privileges. So how does that work if you don't have those admin privileges like full, which allows you to create new users? Have your admin person go in, make these changes to the general ledger, and then have them give you limited admin privileges for the purpose of creating dimensions. All right. And then the last thing that you'll need to do, which I just mentioned a minute ago, is you want to go into Intacct's general ledger. If setup isn't open, you'll want to go down here and open your setup. and go into Configure General Ledger. When you get in this screen, you're going to want to scroll down here, way down to the bottom, and it's referred to as Dimension Relationships down here under Advanced GL. You want to confirm that that's visible, and also enable filter drop-down list between dimensions. It's very useful, so I would recommend that you turn that on. Once you've set up dimensions, you will be able to see in this grid that displays your dimension relationships, whether it's at the auto-populate. We'll talk about setting up your priorities if you have multiple relations set up, and whether you give the user the ability to override the default setting, and also whether there's a restricted value for a dimension. So once you've done all that and you save your entry, you're ready to go with dimensions. So let's go back and take a look at our slideshow, and then we're going to set one up. All right. So in using dimension relationships, the first thing that you want to understand is that they are bidirectional. And what I mean by that is if I set up a dimension relationship between, for instance, a location and a customer, that also means that there is a relationship between the customer and the location. When you go to maintain these and you go into that location code, you'll see those customers listed. If you go to the customer record, you'll see that location listed as well. So there's no one place that you need to go to manage these relationships. In this particular case between location and customer, you can do it either in the location file or you can do it in the customer record as well. The information in Intacct is actually maintained in a table that links between, in this particular case, locations from the location table against the departments in the department table. So in the next slide, this doesn't come through very clearly here in the middle area. This should read D1, D2, 3, and 4. They've gone in and they've established a relationship between L1, which is New York, and in this case D1 and D2. So when we do data entry and we put in location L1, New York, it's going to establish a relationship and tell us that we have the ability then to only work with departments D1 and D2. If we go down and we look at Chicago, which is L2, we see that the only dimensions available out of department are D2 and D5. So this is a nice reference chart to see how the link occurs between the location and the applicable departments in the dimension relationship. All right, as I mentioned before, you can choose it from one side or the other, or we could go over and do it in the department side. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to go in and we're going to set up a dimension. So let's jump in there and get our feet wet with how to actually create a dimension in Intacct. The first thing that you'll want to do, I'm rather fond of approaching this from the Platform Services app, is you'll want to go down to your objects and go to list. And the dimension that I'm going to use is I'm going to create a dimension between location and department. So we scroll down here and we go find our location. We're going to start with that. There we go. We just click on the location name. This brings up a new screen, and along the top banner in kind of a pale yellow color or light brown, you'll see here is the word relationships. All you need to do to create a new one is click on relationships. And here, next we see new relationship. This takes us through to a wizard. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a relationship between my location and my department. So I just pick the dimension that I want to link to. I say next. And then here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose how I want this relationship to exist. And there are 4 choices here, and we can talk about each one. In the first one location to one department simply means that a location is linked directly to a department. So when I enter in location L1, for instance, it would bring up an autofill an applicable department may be D1. If I choose one location to many departments, this is essentially going to give me the ability, when I key in a location, to pick from a pick list of applicable departments. So in a sense, it gives me the ability to filter which departments I'm allowed to work with. There is an optional checkbox when we go set this up that will allow us to override it. But if you're looking for good control with dimension relationships, we recommend that you keep that turned off. The third choice is many locations to one department. So it could in fact be that our various locations, New York, Raleigh, Los Angeles, may have one department that they have a relationship established against. And then probably the most wide open is one called many to many. And that just simply means that for any given location, you may have multiple departments. Keep in mind when you're planning this out, if you want the system to autofill a choice for you, the only one that will not work for autofill is many to many. So let's go ahead and then let's save that. And now what we've seen is that it has created this relationship, and you'll see that here at the header bar, relationship 1 displays. Now, let's take a look at our next steps here. We've gone in, we've created that location, and we've linked it to our department. We've chosen, in this case, we did the one to many. Okay, and here's that slide I was referring to that's important to reference if you ever have any questions about the type of relationship that you're establishing. In the one-to-one, when we go into the customer or into the location record and we give it a department, it only ever functions with one location with that specific department. So it's a one-to-one relationship. The location can only have one department. The department can only be assigned to one location. In a situation where we say one location, or in this case, one customer to many locations, the customer can be assigned to many locations, but the location can only be assigned to one specific customer. So that's rather restrictive. Many customers to one location is just the opposite. So the customer can be related to multiple locations, and each customer is related to one location, but the location can support many customers. Many to many means virtually any combination. Further down, when you set this up, you'll see some location pages that you'll want to go through and highlight. Let's go back and take a look at that. And you'll see further down here, you'll have some check boxes to activate your departments here. All right. And then lastly, you want to activate your department pages so it displays in all of your screens. And this also will help you to maintain your views. And what that means then is you will be able to see on your location view the applicable department pages that are associated with it. Once I've done that, I will then be able to see under my location ID all the various different departments, or in this example, the vendors that are associated with that location. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's set one up. Our original setup involved location and department, so I'm going to pull over here and I'm going to go to company. And what I want to do is I want to go in and I want to assign departments to specific locations. So I'm going to say location. And when I bring up my location, for instance, New York, I'm going to edit that. And now what you will see in the location record is that department dimension that we talked about earlier. And we'll have a pull-down box here. And this will allow us to pick the department that we want to associate with this location. So I'll say department 700. And we could pick multiple. And then when we do our data entry, it would allow us to choose which one we wanted and not allow us to use any other departments for this location. So for New York, we're going to pick just 700. Let's do another one. And we'll do multiple departments. So we'll choose San Francisco. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say, it's popping on another screen, marketing. And we'll choose another one. We'll say sales. There we go. Now, because we set this up as many to one, it's only allowing us to have one. Now, lastly, when we do our data entry, what we should see is that our location code is going to drive the department that's entered into the transaction. Let's go ahead over to accounts payable, and let's put a bill in and see how this works. I'm going to go down, and I'm going to pick an expense account, and I'm going to pick my location of New York. And as soon as I tab across, notice that it auto-populates for the department 700, which was established in our dimension relationship. If we pick another expense account, and let's say we want to pick San Francisco, as soon as we do that, it auto-populates to 500. So for an environment where you want to really tightly control the information being recorded in your data entry screens, this is a great example of how that can be done. Damn it. Sorry, folks. Sorry for the interruption, folks. Okay, so now we've seen the dimension values in play in Intacct. So let's talk about what the autofill dimension filtering will do. If we set up a dimension so that we want to allow many transaction types for many particular departments, we can change that dimension relationship to a one-to-many and allow it to fill in that department. So I'm going to go back, and I'm going to change our assignment here. And we're going to change the relationship of that dimension so that we can assign multiple departments to that. So right here, what we would have is many departments to one location. And we're going to go ahead and save that. And then lastly, what we're going to do is we're going to go back, and for those locations, we're going to give it the ability to use multiple departments. So now, if we use our pick list, we should see that those multiple departments are available. So we'll say 300 for services, and we'll pick 100 for operations. And when we save that, now when we do our data entry, we'll see that for New York, we do not have the full listing of departments available. We will have just the select three. So we'll have 100, 300, and 700. In our data entry screen, as we fill those in for New York, now you will see that based on the location of New York, we have a more narrow listing of the available ones and not all departments. So that's an example of filtering. Okay. So we've talked about how we do that autofill. That can be a one-to-one, a one-to-many, or a many-to-one, in which you have one entry in your dimension. We've also talked about how you can have an autofill by filling that relationship. A couple caveats that you want to be aware of is that when you set this up to autofill, it has to be from the from side of the relationship. In this particular case, it's going to be location that we assign department. So when we fill in our location, it will fill from location through to that department field. Something else to be aware of is that, unfortunately, when you're uploading the CSV uploads or making the API calls to load the data, the system will not conform to the autofill feature. So it's only through the UI that you'll see that feature. Okay. In order to complete the autofill feature, one of the things that you'll need to do is under the properties for the object, you'll want to check this box for autofill objects. So let's go in and let's take a look at that. Is through the UI, we would go here, we would go find our object. Let's go down and find location again. And what you'll find over here is a checkbox for autofill. So you want to make sure that you have that checked. If you want to prevent someone from choosing another available object from the full list, you would want to uncheck this box. Okay, so the next question is, what takes precedence when we have established multiple relationships in the data entry screen? We'll use this one as an example. We have a many-to-one relationship where we have many vendors, and we have identified a specific department for a vendor. So in this example, they have Federal Express, and they've hard-coded in the dimension relationship admin. They've also created a many-to-one relationship between the item and the department. So you can see right here that if we did a data entry, for instance, in a purchase order screen that involved a vendor and then an item, we're going to have a problem here because we've hard-coded the department that whatever we enter FedEx, it should respond in autofill admin. But when we work further down through the line item, we're going to see that for this particular item overnight, it's going to replace admin and it's going to want to use sales. So what do we do? How do we set the precedence? How is the logic going to work to fill this information in? Okay, so let's take a look. The way that we resolve this is in the general ledger under the setup is we are able to go in and identify a priority order. So if we want the, for instance, the vendor to take precedence over the item, we can simply take this vendor and grab the handle there on the left-hand side, and we drag that up to the top of the list above item, and it'll take precedence over the item code when filling in the dimension relationship of department. Okay. Filtering we've talked about by going in and enabling filtering in the general ledger setup, and then applying multiple choices, but not all choices for the department. We're able to get a selective group of departments for each location. The filtering does in fact work with all of the dimension types, just so you're aware of that, with the exception of the one-to-one, because a one-to-one relationship implies that when you fill in one dimension, it autofills and restricts the following dimension to the one that you've hard-coded in. In order for this filtering to take place, you have to go into the general ledger and turn on the filter, which again is located under general ledger, setup, configure general ledger. Scroll down to the bottom, and at the very, very end of the list, what you will find is a choice here for enabling filtering. Okay, here is an example of where we have many-to-manys, and in this particular case, for the vendor, we have admin and pro services, but then we've also coded the dimension for location to support many-to-many with admin and sales. So when we do this data entry, if we started a purchase order and keyed in FedEx, it would want to give us a choice of admin or professional services, but as soon as we move down to the location field, it would then want to offer us choices of admin or sales. So the question is, how do these interact, and what is the net result that's available to us. A nice little Venn diagram that we've got here that explains that if there is commonality between those two choices of the dimensions, that what you will find is the common choice, in this case admin. We go back up and look at our previous screen. We had admin available for both the vendor as well as the location. If there's a common choice in the relationship, it will make that available. If there is no overlap between those two dimension relationships, the value will be blank. A couple things to be aware of is that there are some data entry screens in Intacct that do not support dimension relationships. Those are the time and expense type screens. Order entry, where you're trying to override the item mapping to the general ledger account that's in the posting configuration screen. Same thing with purchasing. In that transaction definition where you're mapping the item types over to the general ledger, you can't override that with a dimension relationship. It'll simply ignore it. And then if you're using labels in either accounts receivable or accounts payable, there's no dimension relationship functionality there. Keep in mind that the same validation rules apply, so that if you code a general ledger account and require certain input, it will enforce it despite the fact that you have a dimension relationship established. Okay, so what happens if you decide to go in and delete a relationship? Intacct gives you a nice little warning. If I go in here under my platform services and decide to remove that dimension relationship that we've created, I'll scroll down to my location. Maybe I decide I just don't like the way I've got this set up. It's not going to destroy any data in your accounting system, but what it will do is it will destroy the setup that you've done here for dimension. So I say delete under relationships. I have to check a checkbox to confirm my deletion. And when I do finally delete that, if I have gone into the location tables and populated all of those department codes and set the system up, it completely erases it. And in this case, is going to remove the relationship and set the location table back to its original state. So you want to be careful before you do that. There's no way to recover that. Once it's erased, it's gone. All right, some further questions here to ponder is what happens if I have a location, in this case New York City, and I've assigned departments for sales and admin, and then I consolidate that into a single location. I no longer have an admin, or you've changed the dimension relationship between the location and the department. What's going to happen to the existing records where NYC and the department is admin? They're going to be there, but it's not going to support any further functioning of that dimensional relationship because it doesn't exist in the database like that anymore. What happens if you edit an existing record after the relationship values have been changed? It's going to conform to the dimension relationship that's in place at the time of editing. So in summary, why would we want to use dimension relationships? First of all, we can speed up our data entry. We can make our data entry more accurate by restricting what data we actually allow in each of our fields as we're putting information into Intacct. Keep in mind it's reciprocal, so if we set up a dimension relationship between a location and a department, like we've done in this particular instance, we can maintain it at the location table, or we can maintain it at the department table. It works either way. We have 4 dimension types, one-to-one, which only allows one relation between one dimension and the other, one-to-many or many-to-one, and finally many-to-many, where you have combinations throughout your database that you want to have your dimensions drive off of. You can set it to autofill to speed data entry, and you can also tell it to put in a filtered list of some select choices for your dimension relationship rather than the full database list, as well as the ability to override those selections should you give the user that type of permission. Dimension relationships, in fact, are validated through the UI, the CSV uploads, and the API calls. All right, and one thing you'll want to keep in mind is that they will not conform to the autofill feature if you're bringing in an import through the CSV or the API. Okay, so that concludes our recording for today. Our next presentation is going to be August the 17th at 2 p.m. And we're going to talk about the new UI called the Action UI that Intacct now has available on a beta level that you can activate from within Intacct if you want to give that a test drive before we meet again. So for any of the functioning companies, this is a demo company, you'll see a little button to enable the UI. So if I go into a working company, you'll see that. You might want to give that a little test drive before we start using, before we do our demo. So if I go in here into a functioning company, you'll see enable UI. Maybe play around with that before our next meeting. So this is Jim Stavanis concluding our meeting. If anyone has any questions, please unmute your phone call or message through the session that you have a question. Thank you.